Okay, so welcome everyone. I see some familiar faces, but I also see lots of new faces, which is really exciting for the WEA. Um, the workshop that Anna and I are offering is a workshop around leadership mind traps and what they are and what they might mean for outdoor leaders. Um, so besides kind of the formal introduction that Emily gave, um, we just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background on kind of how we got to where we are, which is to say that both Anna and I have spent the first half of our careers working in wilderness education with a broad range of population. Anna was um, in England and in Europe. I was in the US. And together, we probably have close to 50 years of love for and experience in outdoor education and training outdoor leaders. And both of us continue to stay connected to wilderness education, even though most of our work today is in leadership development and coaching. And so we're here because we love the outdoors, we love the WEA, and what it has done for us. My first course as a student was in 1996. And so it has been a long journey in the profession that has been made possible in large part by the WEA. And so what we're going to talk about today is what we call leadership mind traps and what they have to do with something that's really, really core to the WEA, which is judgment and decision making. Anna, do you want to say anything before we jump in?
Just to say hello. It's lovely to be here and to see all your faces and to be part of this. It's a real privilege. So yeah, lovely to be here.
Yeah, and I can't read Anna's whole renamed, but so you might not be able to see that she is calling in from the other side of the world in New Zealand, in Christchurch. All right, so we're going to do a little really, really brief history lesson here. Really brief, because somebody else is doing the workshop on the history of the WA, and that's not us. But just to say that the teaching of judgment has been a distinctive of the WA since its foundation in 1977. Since the first courses that Paul Petzel and Frank Lupton were leading in the wilderness of the Tetons. Paul Petzel defined judgment and created the WA with Frank Lupton and Chuck Gregory and I always forget the fourth one, because of his belief of the importance of judgment. Right? Paul thought that judgment was in the ability to relate one thing to all other things that you know. It was this huge thing that allowed people to make connections. And that's what he thought we could teach, right? For him, judgment was the greatest safety factor and the key to effective leadership. And so the founders of the WEA made the claim that not only was judgment central to outdoor leadership, it could actually be taught, and it should be the culminating objective of a curriculum that trains outdoor leaders. That curriculum, as you heard earlier, was the 18-point curriculum that has evolved over the almost 50 years of the association. But also, as Will was talking about, judgment is still the overarching core educational component of the current curriculum. So judgment is key to how the WEA thinks about training outdoor leaders. Two veterans from Outward Bound and Knowles, Todd Schimmelpfennig, whose name I butchered, and I apologize if Todd's on the call, and Brendan Madden, chronicled a few years back how it took 20 years for the rest of the field to come to an agreement about the teachability of judgment, and then to start going about how should we do that, right? While for Paul and the early WA instructors, judgment was primarily developed through reflection and analysis of decisions that one made in the field. So if you've taken a WA course, you know that at the core, an important piece of your experience is the decision-making analysis journal, which students fill out multiple times a day as they reflect on their decisions, on the decisions of the leader of the day, right? In the WA curriculum, when we teach about decision-making, we distinguish between simple decisions and complex decisions. If you haven't gotten your hand on that second edition of the Backcountry Classroom, they are a collector's item. And if you find it somewhere, grab it. Really, the distinction between simple and complex decisions has to do primarily with the context. Complex decisions are decisions that occur in an unpredictable context, where cause and effect are really only knowable after the fact, with hindsight, with reflection. While on the other hand, simple decisions are much more closely connected to clear cause and effect and predictable outcomes. So the WA curriculum continues to acknowledge that complexity is a part of the reality that we as outdoor leaders encounter on a daily basis when we take students into the wilderness. And so when Brendan Madden and Todd Schimmelfennig wrote their article and did their presentation at the Wilderness Risk Managers Conference, they also traced kind of the history of the teaching of decision-making in the field of outdoor education. And what they traced was the shift from, okay, now we've got an agreement that judgment is teachable and how are we going to do it, to really what we need to focus on is decision-making. And more recently, what we need to focus on around decision-making is cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And that's kind of been the evolution of teaching around judgment and decision-making in the field at large. Ken Clement, who was the WEA executive director in the mid-90s, has been an important influence in that evolution. He's written and presented several seminal papers on the psychology of judgment, biases, and decision-making. So I'm not sure how many of you have gotten steeply educated into cognitive biases and how they influenced our decisions in your own courses or in your own study, but you don't have to, because we did a little research. Like every good researcher, we went to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia tells us that there are over 170 cognitive biases which influence our decision-making. I was blown away when I read that. So if you want to study more about cognitive biases, I'd invite you to go check those out. That felt like an awful lot. And in the work that Anna and I do with leaders who navigate complexity, we draw a lot on the work of Jennifer Garvey Berger, who developed the idea of leadership mind traps. And so today, we want to introduce you to 5 leadership mind traps that we think can be helpful to outdoor leaders and are a whole lot easier to remember than the 170 on Wikipedia. All right. So I'm going to pass it to Anna. And before I do that, I just want to double check with Emily where we stand on breakout rooms.
Right now, we don't have them. I'm working on it, but we don't have them yet.
Okie dokie. All right. Thank you for working on it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Francois. Thanks,
Yeah.
Francois. So thinking back, we've had a little bit of history, a bit of recent history from Francois. Let's go back a whole lot further to where we were evolving as a species. And we humans, we evolved in wild places, as you know, where we were pretty defenseless in the face of the, the claws and the fangs of the other creatures that we shared that space with. And we were mostly slower than both our predators and our prey. In order to survive and not get eaten, we learned to make really fast decisions. We had to narrow our focus. We had to run or fight or freeze. And we learned to hide the complexity of the world from ourselves, just to make it simple enough to cope with, to survive. In the forest or the savannah, these thinking skills, quick thinking skills, were life-saving capabilities, and they got hardwired into the human race. So those of our ancestors who didn't do this, well, I guess they didn't get to be our ancestors, really. The trouble is now, as we face into the complexity of the modern world, these habits our minds have of shielding us from complexity have become not life-saving, but dangerous. They're not ways to thrive anymore, but they're traps that we fall into. And we call these automatic responses mind traps. So to lead in effectively in the complex, unpredictable contexts, of which the wilderness and outdoors are great examples, we need to learn to recognize and avoid and escape these mind traps. So in this session, we're going to introduce you to some common mind traps. A set of 4 or 5 common ones that seem to show up very regularly and are very useful to understand and be able to see. And we're going to help you see some tips to avoid them and escape them as well. So mind traps are sense-making shortcuts that are kind of hardwired into our brains. Shortcuts being ways of rapidly making sense of situations and responding. And mind traps have been good for us. They've served our species. They help get us to where we are now at the top of the food chain. And on an individual level, they do support us to be effective in our lives and work. But let's face it, we have to make quick decisions, shortcuts. We have to use assumptions just to get through each day. The trouble is in complexity, and particularly in making decisions and judgments in complex situations, unpredictable environments. Paradoxically, it's these very shortcuts are the things that undermine our present moment effectiveness, and they set up the conditions for failure in the future. So we're going to talk you through them one by one, and Francois is going to tell us about the first one. Over to you, Francois.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. All right. So the first one we call the mind trap of rightness. Neuroscientists have shown that the feeling of certainty that we have is actually an emotion. Much like love, anger, anticipation, it's not the result of a cognitive process. This means that when we believe that we're right, most of the time when we believe that we're right on topics that have no possible right answers, we have a sense of certainty about that. And when we have a sense of being right, we often go on to justify our opinions, try to focus and collect data that reinforces our beliefs, shut down perspectives of others that don't match, shut down how we listen to others, and downright ignore data that might prove us wrong. It's not deliberate obstinacy. It's just the way our brains work. So just because it feels right doesn't actually mean it is. So one place that this trap shows up for outdoor leaders is around decision making among co-instructors or instructor teams, when you hold conflicting ideas about what the next course of action is, whether that be your assessment on the group's capability to tackle the next physical or emotional challenge they're faced with, or your assessment of the risk of the next activity that you are going to do. So this is where we would love for you to go have a conversation with somebody about the ways in which the mind trap of rightness might influence us as outdoor leaders. But if we do not have breakout rooms, we're going to have to come up with an alternative. Emily? Did we lose Emily?
No, do you want me to come up with the alternative? The answer is we don't have breakout rooms yet. But
Okay.
I think Kevin
Right.
is on here
Nope.
trying to help me, but yeah.
All right, fantastic. So we're going to have a, what in the Zoom world is a no-no, which is let's try to have a 42 people conversation. So unmute yourself if you've got and just kind of speak up or type in the chat as you feel most comfortable. And the question really is kind of like, how is this mind trap of rightness shown up for you when you're leading a trip? How does this sense that you are right, almost in the absence of any real consideration of the complexity of the situation, get in your way of having a thoughtful approach to decisions? So you can unmute yourself or type in the chat. If everybody types in the chat, we're going to have kind of a Quaker moment. Thank you, Cameron, for starting the conversation. Oh, nice. Yeah, knowing, right? Just because it was the same, I was there last time, I know exactly what the river looks like. Thank you, Eric. Many times we have to make quick decisions and we might disregard others, right? The pressure. And that's the amazing thing about the right trap, the mind trap of rightness, is that it does allow us to make quick decisions. That's the beauty of it. And there's situations where that is important, right? Mind traps aren't necessarily bad. It's that in complex situations where there is lots of unpredictability, they can actually undermine our ability to have good judgment.
I don't know if I can jump in here. So my name's Kaylee. I'm from Ohio University, a graduate student. I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly or if my thoughts going in a different way, but in a sense of like, if you were I would say an experienced guide in the field, and then you have a participant question you, and understanding like their opinions are also valid in this situation because every opportunity is different and every trip is different. So also like I'm right because I'm the leader versus let's work on this together.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's right. I've done this so many times. I know how this class should be taught, or I know how this lesson ought to be designed. Yeah. You're just a student, right? What do you have to offer to this conversation? Right? That's a great example. Thank you. All right. So Emily?
Yes, I'm here and you're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. All right. Was I on mute as I was talking and I was just kind of moving my lips? Oh, that's
No.
unfortunate.
No, not that entire time. I just momentarily was trying to make you the co-host to get those breakout rooms fixed, and I hit mute instead, but it was only for a moment.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks, Mike and Zachary. Stick to the strip moment, right? We don't go sideways, so we don't try something that we haven't tried before, because what works in the past is going to work again, and it's the best thing we got. So thank you for flexing with us as technology is going the way it is. And we're going to shift to the next mind trap, and I'm going to send it over to Anna to tell us a little bit.
Now you are mute. Great, thanks, Francois. I was thinking about how often rightness actually shows up in navigation. You know, how we make everything fit where we think we are on the map. You know, we somehow make the rest of the map fit what we've already decided, don't we? Because we love to feel that we're right, and reinforce that feeling. It feels great. And another one that feels great is the mind trap of control. It's something we love as humans. We are hardwired to seek control. We love the feeling of being in control. It's not just that we love it, but it gives us real delight, and it gives us the sense that we're able to steer and control things and make things happen and make them better. You know, we love that feeling that we actually have agency. We can do good things and make things better. And actually, the feeling of having control, you know, perceiving ourselves as having control is closely correlated actually with well-being. And we even get less physically sick when we have a high sense of control. So it's something we really are hardwired for. You can probably even think of things that you do that give you a sense of control because it makes you feel better, and you kind of know rationally that you don't have control, but you can get a sense of control and it kind of feels better in some sort of crisis situation. Conversely, of course, when we feel out of control, we feel stressed and we feel anxious. The trouble is, we live in a culture that's mistakenly got us believing that we can be in control of many more aspects of our lives than we actually can in reality. So we try and grab control of things that actually are uncontrollable. And we're pursuing well-being by doing this, but we seek to control outcomes, and we even create systems and processes that charge others with controlling to get certain outcomes in the future as well. And these often lead us to simplistic and ineffective solutions. And that's the problem. When we try to control in complex and unpredictable contexts, we're actually stripped of influence, because acts of control in complexity often have these perverse, unintended effects that are often the very opposite of what we want. And then when things don't work out, we don't ask, could we have controlled for this anyway? Instead, we either blame ourselves for failing to control, or we judge others, usually those above us, saying they didn't exercise the control they should have done. And in complex and unpredictable environments, which are full of interacting and interdependent pieces, we can't actually control for certain outcomes. You know, no one person or even group of people can take charge and control the whole thing and make it go the way we want. Actually, most outcomes emerge from the complex interplay that is completely beyond the control of any one actor in the system. We actually can't force a given outcome to happen. So our desire to control things and our pull towards the feeling of control actually becomes a trap in complexity. So in an unpredictable world, a complex world where control is often not possible, what we need to do to lead well is we actually need to relinquish our desire for control in our false sense of control and open ourselves up to experimentation and learning. We can't control overall outcomes. What we can do is we can try and nudge and influence the conditions that are more likely to create better outcomes. And that's subtly but really importantly different from trying to actually directly control everything. So when we feel unhappy or insecure or at risk, we tend to try and control harder. We believe we've got more control than we really do. And then we sometimes substitute what can be measured for what matters, because what can be measured gives us a feeling of control, but it's often not really what actually matters to us. So for example, as outdoor leaders, we can't directly control people's enjoyment or their experience of adventure or learning or satisfaction with the experience that they have as our clients. And yet sometimes we fixate on the tangible, measurable objectives because they're easier to define and use as a target or a measure of a successful outdoor experience, like a famous named summit or rapid, for example. We want to tick them off, don't we? We want to say we've done them. We want our clients to come back saying they reached this summit or paddled this rapid. And because they're definable, the sense that we can control for these targets is really attractive to us. You know, we want to bag the summit at all costs, or we want to run the rapid instead of portaging it, even when it looks a bit risky. We get trapped by the illusion of control, and then we let these tangible kind of definable targets become the main objective as we convince ourselves that we can directly control for them. And this can make us take more risks and ultimately affecting our clients and our safety. And it's ironic because actually our real objectives for the whole experience were probably much more nuanced and less measurable things like learning, growth, adventure, sharing outdoor experiences with friends, connecting with nature, being comfortable in the backcountry, growing relationships, and so on. And these aren't things that are clean, hard targets. These are far more nuanced. In fact, what these nuanced outcomes are, which tend to be the things we really want, they're actually emergent properties of the complex system of interdependent factors at play. We can't directly control them, and we need to let go of our desire to feel we're in control, or we're likely to get fixated on the simpler, more tangible outcomes. What we can do, though, is we can be thoughtful about how we influence the conditions that are most likely to lead to the outcomes that we really value. So let's have a little think about how that shows up for us in control. I've got there's some little comments coming up in the chat. That's great. What did you achieve rather than what's an achievement? Yeah, that's great. Let's throw out, we don't have breakouts yet, do we, Francois? No, we don't.
No, it's a platform-wide problem where everybody's trying to work on it. I apologize.
All right, well, let's do the same as we did last time. Have a think about how the mind trap of control shows up for you, or when you've seen it in your work as an outdoor leader. Look out for the connection between your experience of control and your sense of happiness and well-being. What are some things?
I can speak up, Lucas. Just thinking about. Sorry, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, go, Lucas.
Okay, great. Just really, we kind of get fixated as instructors if we have, course objectives or course outcomes, and a lot of times, like, we want to control that experience. Because that's kind of how we measure this success, I guess, of a course. But then all the other variables that kind of come into play, as we all know, as wilderness leaders, that do happen within that. But I'm just kind of curious, just want to throw this kind of question out there. Is like, we want to control this, but also as an instructor, if you have participants, if you don't have some sort of control or feel like you're controlling the outcomes, at what point can you go and be like, well, this instructor doesn't really know what they're doing, and kind of have this kind of lucid of like, we're just going to experience out here in the wilderness, and we don't know what the objective, is going to come out of this. And so I'm just curious of thoughts of just, you have tangible outcomes that you need to for a course, but then how do you let everything else kind of play out while still maintaining control?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Lucas. And I think what we're on about here is separating out the different types of control we can have, the different sort of levels of directness of the control that we can have over things, and being aware of what things we are trying to control directly that actually can't be controlled directly, and what things we're trying to influence. And then absolutely controlling the things that we can control directly. Like, we can control whether everyone has the right gear or not when they head out. There's certain sort of simple things that we can control. We can control whether the weather forecast is checked before we go. There's certain things that we can control. Absolutely, those need to be directly controlled. What we're saying is we fall into the trap of thinking we can control everything like that, in the way that we control those things. And of course we can't. And it's often the very reason that we're there, the more nuanced outcomes, those are the things we can't control in that very direct way. And the trap is thinking that we can control them in a very direct way, when actually we can't. We have to handle them differently. So we're not in any way saying control is out the window at all. We're getting a bit more sophisticated in the way that we think about control, and the different ways and levels at which we can control different things. Does that help? Cause control is not always helpful for solution, and often fights to have control take away from the real problem that needs to be solved. So much more is attached. Yeah, that's lovely, Katja. Thanks. Yeah, that's great. I think we're having a bit more sophisticated view of control, and what control is one word that we use a lot, and it covers so many different things. So what we're saying here is, let's have a bit more of a nuanced understanding of control and what things can and can't be controlled, and make sure that we're not kidding ourselves that we can control things that actually can't. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Lovely. Differentiation between control, influence, and accept. Yeah, thanks, Cameron. That's what we're on about. There was something higher up in the chat as well.
I was just thinking about the temptation to control our participants' emotional reactions to the context that we put them in, especially when we see value, going back to the previous, that of what we assume that we know. We put them in contexts that we know are for their best outcomes, and we expect a certain reaction. And when we don't see that, we almost overfixate on trying to control that in them.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jamie. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good, because emotion, someone's emotional response, of course, is an emergent property of a complex system, isn't it? You can't, it's not a predictable thing that is always the same. Absolutely, that's a really good example. Yeah, and we just cannot control for things that are emergent properties of complex systems. We can control for simple inputs, like having the right gear. Yeah, that's a great example. There was something else higher up in the chat. Oh yeah, how is control related to ego, a very dangerous trait? That's a great question, Todd, and we are going to come to that a little bit later, just briefly. We'll touch on that near the end, just briefly. So thanks for raising that. Yeah. Great. All right. Any coach of mine always said, anything you control is attitude and effort. Yeah. Nice. Attempting to control emotional reaction contributes to neglecting the potential for personal growth and expressing boundaries we encounter during trips. Yeah, great. Yeah, great examples. Thanks, everyone. All right, over to you, Francois.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. All right, so the third mind trap is the mind trap of agreement. We crave agreement and we hate conflict. Most of us, at least, do. We've kind of evolved as a species to orient ourselves to the opinions and the desires of others as a means of survival. If I've got a crew or a tribe with me, I am more likely to survive than if I am ostracized and expelled. And when we disagree with one another, we experience a social distress that's actually neurologically indistinguishable from physical pain. So the researchers who discovered this went on to say, so actually the best way to make it through a first date is to pop 2 aspirins before you go, because the impact of pain reliever on managing the social distress that you might experience in a first date is actually your body. It is the one and the same. So this distress that we can feel when we are alienated or separated from the group can lead groups to fall into kind of a mass agreement, right? A group think way too easily, and to forgo valuable options when dealing with complex decisions. In other words, like seeking to get along literally robs us of good ideas. Now, of course, this mind trap also has a flip side, which is that when we've decided that someone isn't part of our tribe, when we've got disagreement, then we actually polarize and amplify our differences, which is an equally unhelpful response, right? In the wilderness, on expeditions, you see this often in group decisions when, as instructor, you allow the group to take responsibility for what comes next, whether it's a design or an activity, right? Or among leadership teams, if you are leading with 2, 3, 4, 5 people, right? When there are common objectives and risk assessments that need to be made, right? Who wants to be the killjoy who raises their hand to say, hey, I think that interaction you two had over there, just it's a little problematic. Or who's going to say, hey, let's hike another couple miles up the river rather than cross right here and set up camp on the other side, right? So the mind trap of agreement, right, can really be dangerous in our decision making. So where have you seen the mind trap of agreement in your work in the field or with colleagues?
Well, I would like to say that I've definitely have seen this in my own work, working at summer camps and like disagreeing kind of fundamentally with some um, aspects as far as like what to do in situations with like, you know, how do we react to a certain situation based on like, you know, how do you take care of this issue with this child? And there's definitely been times when it's been like kind of going back to rightness, where it's like I kind of get polarized because I kind of sit there and I say, even though it's not my decision, like this is what I think should have been done. And then there's other times when I've let things happen that I could have influenced, but I later on I regret those. Like I should have said something, and I should have probably not been afraid to disagree with that person in that moment.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
I agree with Todd's little statement here, and I've taught a lot with Todd. We always used to say, you're not going to have agreement all the time, and to expect conflict. But we also then will teach them how to behave in conflict. And that's really critical. And we used to use Johnson's shark turtle kind of ways of doing it. You know, you can either act as a shark or a turtle or a fox or an owl, and that became a new language that they could use. And it made them think, well, how shall I react in the situation? Shall I be an owl? Shall I be a fox? And so on. Of course, you have to know exactly what all that means. But we found that to be pretty effective, to say that you are going to have conflict. And if you don't, there's something wrong. But you need to know how to deal with it and how to behave. And then you can actually get through it. Unless it's some kind of interpersonal, a deep-seated psychological thing that you need Freud for, and then you just got to contain it.
Yeah, that's a great example, Maurice. Like, we need to prepare our students for the experience of conflict, and we need to equip them to be able to navigate it with one another in a way that's healthy and productive. And I love the example of that you were given around the roles or the types of approaches that one could bring to conflict. Thanks.
I think it's really helpful, like Morris was saying too, to if you can do that before the group actually gets into that kind of conflict, and you know, then they know it's coming and they go, oh, there it is, and it's not an abnormal, you know, it's not an abnormal thing.
Mm-hmm. Right, it is part of life. Thank you, Todd. That's such a great point. All right, we're gonna keep going because it would really be disappointing if we didn't like finish all the mind traps and left you hanging before the end of this session. So Anna, I'll pass it over back to you.
Yeah, all right. So the next mind trap is the mind trap of simple stories, telling ourselves simple stories that really don't capture the complexity of what's really going on. And this trap comes from our collective love for stories. You know, as a human race, we've told stories throughout our history, and these have enabled our communities and religions and organizations to form and grow and become strong and sort of hold what we value and what we know. And our brains are set up to look for these simple narratives. So we search for the story in the moment. We try and identify a beginning, a middle, and an end, because it helps us make sense of what's happening. But in reality, things are much more complex. In the real world, it's all sort of messy middles and imperfect humans. And so the stories that we look for, that our minds are drawn to, they drastically simplify the world around us, and they give us a sense that we know what's coming next, or how a person might behave. And our simple stories that we tell ourselves are so attractive that we don't just discard the data that disproves them. We fabricate data and we sort of fill in the blanks of our stories without even noticing that we're doing it. So for example, when we look back, we tend to connect items in the past as cause and effect, and tell ourselves that that's why a certain thing happened, and leave it at that. Don't investigate it anymore. We say that thing that happened first led to this next thing happened, which happened next, which led to this next thing that happened. Sort of beginning, middle, end. And in reality, events don't tend to work in such simple, linear causal consequences. There's usually multiple factors going on. But our brain handles this complexity by sort of editing and filling in the gaps so that events conform to this really simple story. And you see this when people start to try and understand why an accident happened. And they fixate on one thing that caused it and fail to realize that usually there's a range of things that all contributed to a complex situation which led to a bad judgment or an accident happening. Sometimes we even make the whole story up. It's not even filling in gaps, we make the whole thing up. And we tend to think this way about the future as well. So we think if we see familiar things unfolding, if we sense that we know the sort of beginning event, we rush to knowing that it'll work this way in the future because it worked this way in the past. And so we predict the middle and the ending from this beginning that we're seeing now. And it's a good characteristic. We're problem-solving creatures. Again, it's a way that we've survived, and we constantly look to make meaning out of problems and develop shortcuts to solve them. And then we communicate these to ourselves and others through stories. So, and what do we do with people within this? We sort of sketch these simple characters, we make everyone either a villain or a hero, a clear villain or a clear hero. Those who are with us in pursuing the ending that we want to see, or those who are against us, we tend to make them either mad, bad, or stupid in some way or other. And this was helpful once, when you need to divide people up into your friends and your enemies. But in an unpredictable and complex world, our simple stories, our oversimple stories, trap us by hiding the full set of possibilities and risks from us. And so they can mislead us into danger. So notice when you're trapped by simple stories when your desire for a simple story blinds you to a real story. So things that show us this are your belief that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you're making simple connections between cause and effect. If you're projecting forward from the past into the future and filling in the missing pieces to make it all make sense. Or you're creating simple characters, which include yourself, and the way that you select the data to support your beliefs about people. So for example, that situation when you look at a slope and you go, well, there's some tracks on it, must be safe. It's probably not avalanche prone. Somebody else is skiing it. It's probably okay. Or you say, this is our slope. We ski this every year. It's always okay. We're going to ski it because this is our one. We do this. Or I've paddled this river before and it didn't feel at all dangerous then. Or this client has got so many stories of being on the river as a child. He sounds like he really knows what he's doing. He's been here. Well, he grew up around here. He knows his way around. He knows what he's doing. He must be really experienced. So I don't need to watch him as closely as the others. Or students from this school are always thoughtful and careful. We work with the school every year. So I can relax a bit with these guys. Simple stories, they've oversimplified, we've filled in the gaps, and they can lead us into all sorts of trouble. So what have you experienced in that area? Where do you notice yourself falling into the trap of holding a story that's way simpler than the actual reality? Yeah, that's a good comment, Jacob. In reality, there may not be a bad guy, but with human beings, then there's just miscommunication between people. Yeah. No one's really ever just simply bad or simply good, are they? Yeah, it's making assumptions based on certain facts, but it's connecting all those assumptions and filling in the gaps between the facts and making it a coherent story, because we're conditioned, our minds love making sense of things through a story. So we're conditioned to turn it into a kind of a linear sort of story that's often simpler than it really is.
I think maybe we fall into this trap sometimes with the event planning that we, with event planning, especially events we've done in the past, that we have the beginning and the process and where it's going to come out at the end, and instead of actually living that, or being prepared that that trip plan could fail us, or that there's an opportunity to deviate from that somewhere in the middle for some really good outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, simplify, that's good on camera as well. Simplifying the characters helps me find allies that agree with, firstly, how bad they are, and secondly, how great I am. Yeah. Yeah. Addressing extra, yeah, seeing certain groups as difficult groups. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like the one about the PFD. Yeah. That's a classic, isn't it? They've got the gear, must know what they're doing. Yeah.
So there is, and I'm going to keep us moving so we get a chance to not drop folks off at the end. And there is a fifth mind trap. I feel like this might be a little of a bait and switch, because initially we were going to do all 5 mind traps, and then realized the fifth one really does need more space than we have in an hour. The fifth mind trap is the mind trap of identity or ego, to go back to that earlier comment in the chat. And often we think about that identity mind trap as the parent mind trap, because it kind of influences and connects with all the other mind traps. And one way to think about the identity mind trap is the ways in which we are constantly protecting and projecting our identities, often in ways that we are not aware, and that work of protecting and projecting our identities might actually keep us from growing and learning and becoming who we are being pulled to develop as a leader into. All right, so we're not going to go further into that mind trap today, but we want to encourage you, if that's something that piqued your interest, or if you want to go deeper into the other 4 mind traps, please, there's all kinds of resources on the web, and of course, Garvey Berger's book is a great place to start. So we're going to do a quick review, and then we've got a little bit of an activity I think we were hoping to get done.
All right, so a little summary, just to skim over the top of these 4 big mind traps that we've mentioned, and then the 5th one that Francois just talked about. So we've got rightness, the feeling of rightness, and note that it's a feeling, it's an emotion actually, and it leads us to the belief that we're right. So we end up treating people differently, and we miss important data because we think we're right. So we've got agreements, the mind trap of agreement. So we either avoid or compromise or polarize, and all of these shut down the diversity of perspectives that we need to make good judgments in complex environments. We got control. So we feel great when we feel as though we can control things, and we often do things just to give ourselves a sense of a feeling of control because it makes us feel better. And we sometimes substitute what we want for what we can measure. And we have a simple measure, and that distracts us from the ways in which we can influence but not control the things that really matter. And we've got simple stories. So the mind trap of simple stories, we oversimplify things and create linear lines of cause and effect, and we create heroes and villains and put everybody into one or other of those buckets and artificially assign sort of beginnings, middles, and tidy endings for things. And then we've got the last one, the parent mind trap of ego, which Frances just mentioned briefly, but you'll have to do some more reading to find some more about. So what do you want to do next, Francois? Should we go to the stamps on the slide?
Yeah, let's do that. I'm going to move us along to this slide. Can you see it? So we're gonna run an experiment. This is going to take all your Zoom tech savviness. All right. What we'd like you to do is to think back to a failure that you have had as an outdoor leader. Something happened and it just did not go the way you had hoped. Maybe something bad happened, or maybe something bad didn't happen, but you still carry this sense of this is not the way that I wanted it to go, and this is not the way that I want to show up as an instructor. And think about that situation, and think about which of the traps that we've talked about might actually have been at play in that moment. And the way that we're going to kind of scan this is to encourage you to go to the annotate feature in Zoom. And when you click on annotate, you get kind of a ribbon of things. And there's one that is stamp. And so you click on stamp and you've got 6 possible stamp, and just grab your stamp and pop it in to which of the mind traps feels like we're most salient and at work in that experience of failure. I'm going to erase mine before you guys all pop back in.
Just in case you can't see it, annotate is under view options at the top of your screen.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to let folks populate that.
That's interesting, hey? What a cool experiment.
So the closer you are to one of the corners, the more that mind trap was influenced. The further you are, then you might have noticing the interaction of multiple mind traps. Isn't that interesting, man? I feel like all right, we got a little bit of balance, but we are really leaning on the control and rightness. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That right side of the triangle or the pentagon is really, there's a research study for some doctoral student. Okay. What do you as you guys as y'all are looking at this and people are continuing to populate, what do you notice? What does that make you think of?
There's some answers in the chat, Francois, if you're able to see those,
thanks.
or I can read them to you.
Oh, thanks. I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I lost track. Thanks, Anne. It's like agreement isn't showing up as much because we've seen it as a positive thing. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, interesting. My closest time to dying in the outdoors with a group was through agreement. Luckily we didn't, but that's my worst situation, worst example was definitely about agreement. Yeah.
All right. Any other noticings or just questions that this raises for all you folks who are in charge of training outdoor leaders or running programs? Imagine this is at least some interesting place to start the next staff training.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Eric. Uh, for me personally, it was more towards like the idea of identity in agreement, which is kind of like sometimes as the leader, you kind of like want people to like you. So sometimes you be too lenient, and that was like the thing that I most failed with.
Mm,
And yeah.
yeah, thanks, Eric, for saying that. So we are coming to the end of our session, unfortunately. Well, maybe unfortunately for us. Maybe you're ready to come off and go grab your cup of coffee or move on to another session. But we wanted to thank you all for joining us and for this kind of introduction to Mindtraps, and to offer some resources. We really appreciate the way that y'all just kind of were flexible with the technology not quite going as we had hoped, and engaging the conversations and the chat. And if this is an introduction. If you want to learn more, there's tons of resources, and we encourage you to go find them either in hardcover or on the web.